The Wild West wasn't just about cowboys and saloons. Lurking beneath the vast, seemingly endless sky was a constant threat. Twisters. These ferocious, twirling storms, more commonly called tornadoes today, were a terrifying reality for settlers and pioneers venturing westward. This video essay explores the destructive power and unpredictable nature of specific twisters during this pivotal era in American history, examining how they challenged the lives and resilience of those who dared to tame the frontier. The night before disaster struck, a fierce storm raged over Concordia Parish and Adams County. Heavy rain soaked the ground, leaving many in Natchez, Mississippi, worried about working the fields the next day. Across the river in Vidalia, life continued at a slower pace. Small businesses and farms dotted the landscape, a stark contrast to the hustle and the bustle of the river port in Natchez. The area was teeming with activity, especially in the under-the-hill district, where warehouses and shops lined the riverbank. Steamboats, flatboats, and smaller skiffs crowded the water, filled with merchants and boatmen trading goods. The infamous steamboat Prairie, notorious for leaving another vessel burning a few years prior, was among them. As noon approached on May 7, 1840, nothing hinted at the impending catastrophe. With no weather service to warn them, the residents of Natchez and Vidalia were completely unaware of the monstrous tornado brewing 20 miles southwest. The twister roared to life in the Deer Park and Slocum areas, uprooting trees and flinging debris through the air. People and animals scattered in terror as the funnel cloud grew in size and power. The tornado ripped northeast, following the Mississippi River unseen by the unsuspecting townsfolk. Drawn outside by the cooling rain after the morning storm, they had no idea the real danger was yet to come. By 1 p.m., the monstrous twister, a mile wide and carrying a deadly mix of water, debris, and timber, slammed into Natchez and Vidalia. The river churned into a frenzy, tossing boats and people high into the air. Buildings along the banks, houses, stores, and even steamboats were ripped to shreds. In Natchez, the central and northern parts of the town took the brunt of the attack. The air filled with a terrifying ballet of destruction. Walls, roofs, chimneys, and entire trees flying through the air like missiles. The aftermath was horrifying. Under the hill was a desolate wasteland, bodies buried beneath the wreckage. The Natchez Free Trader reported a scene of utter devastation, with the wounded crying for help and the dead left unburied. Homes across the town were flattened, and the destruction continued across the river in Concordia Parish. Plantations were destroyed, crops ruined, and countless lives lost, with many slaves presumed dead. With no modern emergency services, the townspeople were left to fend for themselves. The devastation on the river was immense. Flatboats, the lifeblood of the river trade, were sunk by the dozens, drowning most on board. The infamous steamboat Prairie, along with the Hines and St. Lawrence, did not live to see the light of day. The Natchez tornado of 1840 remains the second deadliest in U.S. history, estimated to have caused over 317 deaths and 109 injuries. The true toll was likely much higher, especially amongst the enslaved population. Due to racist politics at the time and all levels of government, enslaved folks killed in natural disasters were not counted amongst the deceased. Here's a direct quote from a local newspaper called The Free Trader, detailing just how impacted enslaved populations were. Reports have come in from plantations 20 miles distant in Louisiana, and the rage of the tempest was terrible. Hundreds of slaves killed, dwellings swept like chaff from their foundations, the forest uprooted, and the crops beaten down and destroyed. Never, never, never was there such desolation and ruin. With winds exceeding 200 miles per hour, the tornado's power likely matched an F5, the most destructive category. Some speculated it could have been an F6, with winds up to 379 miles per hour, though this has never been recorded, and the elusive F6 rating is now generally accepted as an impossibility of modern weather phenomenon. The only deadlier tornado was the tri-state tornado of 1925, killing 695 and injuring over 2,000. On a stormy day in 1884, a cluster of twisters, some of the strongest ever seen, ripped through parts of what's now South Dakota. At least 5 of these twisters caused major damage, and one even got its picture taken, a first for such a powerful storm. This special tornado, estimated to be incredibly strong, like an F4 on the Fujita scale, struck near Howard and had a strange twist. It seemed to have multiple spinning funnels working together. The storm left a path of destruction, killing at least 7 people and hurting 2 more. While folks back then thought the twisters were super powerful, all fitting the description of an F3 or F4 tornado, there's no way to be 100% sure because records from that time aren't perfect. The coolest part of this whole event, photographer F.N. Robinson from Minor County managed to capture a photo of the multi-funnel twister near Howard. Later, folks figured out the exact spot where the picture was taken, Epiphany in Minor County. This photo wasn't the only record of the storm. The South Dakota State Historical Society says the twisters were part of a bigger storm system that messed things up big time, especially along the James River Valley. People there lost animals, buildings, and sadly, at least 6 lives. Robinson's photo might be the most famous, but there's more. Samuel W. Green, who worked for the U.S. Army, drew pictures of at least 2 other tornadoes from the storm. Scientists now believe the tornado in Robinson's photo was incredibly strong, with winds reaching up to 200 miles per hour. All the tornadoes from that day are thought to have been super powerful as well. Robinson even managed to take 3 pictures of the Howard twister because it hung around long enough for him to set up his camera. However, all but the aforementioned copy have been destroyed or lost to history. Robinson's notes say the storm passed about 22 miles from Howard and showed up around 4 p.m. There are also reports of people seeing twisters near Huron earlier that day, around 3 p.m. Apparently, someone named J.C. Judkin even took a photo of a tornado near Huron, but that picture hasn't survived through the years. A man named Glenn wrote a report about the storm, describing both white and dark twisters near Huron, with smaller ones leaving a trail of damage. One tornado even looked like a white line with a bright end, which some folks thought was a ball of fire, although there wasn't any real fire. Newspapers looked burned, plants seemed scorched, and straw became brittle, all because of the storm's intense power. One woman named Mrs. Briggs was in her basement when a tornado lifted her whole house, destroyed it, and even threw cows into the air. Glenn himself saw multiple twisters, including a black funnel that kept getting bigger and stronger. Even though Robinson's photo might have been slightly edited, it's still considered accurate and shows 2 smaller funnels next to the main one. Robinson even made copies of the photo to sell as souvenirs. People who witnessed the storm told their stories shortly after it happened, and a researcher named S.D. Flora even collected more accounts in 1950. Laura Ingalls Wilder, the famous author of the Little House on the Prairie novels, even wrote about the tornado in her book, These Happy Golden Years. Historians and a weather expert confirmed that Wilder was describing the same tornado Robinson photographed. Her story even mentions 3 funnels and a boy who died, which matches up with other records of the 1884 storm. A big day arrived in New Richmond, Wisconsin on June 12, 1899. The Gulmer Brothers Circus was in town, and hundreds of visitors joined the usual 1,600 residents for the festivities. By 3 p.m., the sky turned gloomy, with dark clouds gathering. As the circus wrapped up around 4:30 p.m., a heavy downpour began, and some ice chunks mixed in. The rain stopped around 5 p.m., and people started heading home. But by 6 p.m., the streets were alive with locals, tourists, and travelers. Meanwhile, a nasty surprise was brewing about 5 miles south of Hudson, near the eastern shores of Lake St. Croix. A swirling cloud, like a giant pot of boiling water, touched down around 5:30 p.m. This twister moved northeast, avoiding populated areas like Hudson by following the twists and turns of the Willow River and the Omaha Railroad tracks. Several farms in the rural areas of Burkhart and Boardman weren't so lucky and were ripped apart by the tornado. Back in New Richmond, the town had little warning before the tornado hit. Lightning briefly illuminated the twister, but buildings and trees mostly blocked the view. At first, people heard a low rumble in the distance, mistaking it for a train. Panic erupted as the tornado got closer and became more visible, with people scrambling to find any safe haven they could. Shortly after 6 p.m., disaster struck as the tornado slammed into the town's southwest corner, a wealthy neighborhood with many large houses, causing widespread destruction. The twister further unleashed its fury on New Richmond's heart, the business district. This 3-block area bustled with shops, offices, and apartment buildings built with brick and stone. Many folks ran inside these seemingly strong structures for shelter, but a terrible twist of fate awaited them. As the tornado ripped through, the heavy debris from these very buildings caved in, burying those who sought safety beneath. The town bank and the Methodist church were no match for the tornado's wrath and were reduced to rubble. The power of the twister was unbelievable. It tossed a giant safe, weighing over 3,000 pounds, a whole block away. The church bell, made of cast iron and tipping the scales at over 2,000 pounds, was flung nearly 200 feet. Even a sturdy iron bridge wasn't spared. The tornado yanked it from its supports and dumped it on the riverbank like a child's toy. City Hall and the water tower suffered the same fate, with the water tower unleashing a torrent that flooded the streets. The tornado then roared through the eastern part of town, where many working-class families lived. This area was practically wiped off the map. Nearly every house was flattened, leaving behind just a mess of debris and bare foundations. Even the big trees weren't spared. Some were stripped bare of leaves and branches, looking like twisted skeletons. In just a short span of 7 to 10 minutes, more than half of New Richmond was left in ruins. But the tornado's destructive path didn't end there. It continued its rampage northeast, following the railroad tracks. It mainly tore through rural areas, taking 2 more lives north of New Richmond. Several farms in the Stanton area were hard hit, and a nearby village narrowly escaped the twister's wrath. The tornado then barreled into Polk County, reaching within 2 miles of Clear Lake. The tornado continued its destructive spree, wiping out homes and farms near Richardson and Clayton. Finally, it moved east into Barron County. The tornado fizzled out a few miles southwest of Barron, but not before causing significant damage to the town. Maybe the most fascinating bit of survivors' testimony came from a blind man named Henry Kane, who eloquently described his first-hand experience with a near-death tango with a twister. The following are direct quotes from Mr. Kane. A heavily laden freight train produces an uneven, jarring, vibrating sound, mingled with a confused mass of lesser sounds, pitched in a higher key, having somewhat the effect of echo or overtones, the entire ensemble of sounds changing rapidly in volume and intensity. The new Richmond F5 produced a dull, deep, even sullen grinding sound, which for 5 minutes grew in intensity and volume, continuously along a crescendo, until it reached its stupendous climax of appalling fury as it fell upon the doomed city. I can now hear a frightful roaring of enormous proportions and of unvarying intensity and volume. In the upper air above this, there was a tremendous bellowing of appalling magnitude, which gained in intensity and volume as it orchestrated up and down an irregular and variable tonal scale. From the center of the sound area there was emitted a pulsating or puffing sound, coming at regular time intervals that seemed to make the earth quiver. This sound would perfectly suggest the puffing in unison of 1,000 locomotives laboring up a steep grade. The heavy, pulsating puffing gave the entire sound mass a rhythmical effect. It were as if nature had for a moment colleagued with Satan to condense the pent-up din and tumult of hell into one vast, discordant symphony. I then knew it had reached the outskirts of the city and had begun tearing the buildings to shreds. The crackling noise had now become frightful and continuous. I knew the tornado was sweeping everything in its track and was coming directly towards me. I took one soul-devouring survey of the conditions about me, since I thought it might be the last, and then I fled. Without the technology of today, only these intensely detailed eyewitness reports passed down through oral tradition can sustain the lore and legacies of Old West tornadoes into the modern age. While the American frontier was a deadly place, most of the historically discussed dangers lurked in the form of outlaws or hostiles, or disease or famine. It shouldn't be forgotten that Mother Nature was, is, and will always be the most destructive of them all, Wild West or otherwise.